Every night at 2 a.m., Shadow the mutt who once saved the family from a fiery grave growled low and fierce beside little Ethan's crib, as if staring down a ghost in the dark. Was it loyalty or a desperate warning ignored, building to the moment Emily screamed in gut-wrenching terror? "My baby's not breathing." Subscribe now to unravel this haunting tale. The old wooden house on the edge of Willow Creek creaked under the weight of a late autumn breeze, its faded paint peeling like memories of better days. Nestled beside a sprawling cornfield in the Midwest, it was the kind of place where you could hear the silence. Until recently. Emily Harper stood in the kitchen, her hazel eyes sunken from sleepless nights, cradling a mug of lukewarm coffee. Across the room, her husband Mike slumped in a chair, his calloused hands flipping through a farming catalog, pretending everything was fine. Their 6-month-old son, Ethan, slept upstairs in his crib, or so they hoped. Beside that crib, though, was Shadow, their 3-year-old mutt, and lately Shadow had been anything but quiet. Shadow wasn't just any dog. 3 years ago, Mike had found him shivering in a ditch near the highway, a scrappy mix of shepherd and who knows what else, with matted fur and a limp. They'd taken him in from the local shelter, and he'd repaid them tenfold. One winter night, when a gas leak seeped into the garage from a faulty heater, Shadow had barked until his throat was raw, waking them just before the fumes turned deadly. Mike still bragged about it at the diner. "That mutt's got a nose like a bloodhound and guts like a lion." Emily loved him too. He'd slept beside Ethan's crib since the day they brought the baby home, a furry guardian with soulful brown eyes. But something had changed. A week ago, Emily had woken to a sound that sent chills down her spine. A low, guttural growl, steady as a heartbeat, coming from upstairs. She'd stumbled out of bed, her bare feet slapping the cold hardwood, and found Shadow standing rigid beside Ethan's crib. The baby slept soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling under a blue blanket, but Shadow's hackles were up, his ears pinned back, his gaze locked on something unseen. "Shadow, hush," she'd whispered, tugging his collar. He'd stopped, reluctantly, but the next night it happened again. And the next, always at 2 a.m., like clockwork. "Mike, I'm telling you, something's wrong," Emily said now, setting her mug down with a clatter. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt toast. She'd been too distracted to cook properly. "He's growling every night. It's not normal." Mike didn't look up from his catalog. "Dogs get jealous, Em. Ethan's taking all our attention, Shadow's just acting out. He'll get over it." "Jealous?" Emily's voice sharpened. "This isn't some petty tantrum. You've seen his eyes when he does it. He's scared or angry or, I don't know, something. He's never growled at Ethan before. Maybe he's hearing coyotes outside," Mike offered, flipping a page. "They've been howling near the fields lately." Emily shook her head. "Coyotes don't make him growl like that. It's different, deeper, like he's warning us." She crossed her arms, her flannel shirt bunching at the elbows. "Remember the gas leak? He saved us, Mike. What if he's trying to do it again?" Mike sighed, finally meeting her gaze. His face was weathered from years of hauling hay and fixing tractors, but his blue eyes softened a little. "That was 3 years ago. He's a dog, not a superhero. Look, if it bugs you that much, check him out. But I'm not losing sleep over it." Emily didn't argue further, not yet. That night, she dug out an old baby monitor with a grainy video feed and set it up in Ethan's room. The nursery was small, painted a cheerful yellow that clashed with the house's rustic bones. Ethan's crib sat against the far wall, a mobile of stars dangling above him. Shadow curled up beside it, his black and tan fur blending into the shadows. Emily kissed Ethan's forehead. His soft baby smell always calmed her, then whispered to Shadow, "You're a good boy, aren't you? What's going on with you?" At 2 a.m., the monitor crackled to life on her nightstand. Emily bolted upright, her heart pounding as if it might crack her ribs. The screen glowed in the dark, showing Shadow on his feet, tail stiff, growling that same eerie sound. Ethan slept on, oblivious, but Shadow's eyes glinted in the dim light, fixed on the crib. Emily watched, breath held, waiting for something, anything, to explain it. A raccoon at the window? A creak in the floorboards? Nothing. Just Shadow growling at empty air. She played the footage for Mike the next morning. He squinted at the tiny screen, scratching his stubbled jaw. See? Nothing there. He's just spooked by his own shadow or something. But why every night? Emily pressed. Why always at 2 a.m.? It's not random, Mike. I can feel it. Feelings don't fix tractors, and they don't explain dogs, he said, standing to refill his coffee. If you're that worried, call a vet. But I'm not jumping at ghosts. Emily bit her lip, frustration bubbling under her skin. Mike was stubborn as the rusty plow out back, but she couldn't shake the unease clawing at her. Shadow wasn't a jealous pet throwing a fit. She'd seen the way he'd nuzzle Ethan, gentle as a breeze. This was different, primal, like he was staring down a threat she couldn't see. She glanced out the kitchen window at the cornfield, its golden stalks swaying under a gray sky. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. That afternoon, she sat on the porch with Shadow at her feet, running her fingers through his coarse fur. His ears twitched, catching sounds she couldn't hear. "What's out there, boy?" she murmured. "What's got you so worked up?" He tilted his head, whining softly, and for a moment, she swore his eyes held a secret, a warning trapped behind those deep brown pools. She didn't know it yet, but that growl was just the beginning. Something was coming, something Shadow sensed in the marrow of his bones. And soon, Emily would have to decide. Trust her husband's logic or the dog who'd once pulled them from the jaws of death. The kitchen clock ticked past noon, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Emily Harper. She stood by the sink, scrubbing a plate with more force than necessary, the suds splashing onto her worn flannel shirt. The footage from the baby monitor still looped in her mind Shadow's rigid stance, his low growls echoing through the grainy black and white screen. She couldn't shake it, couldn't scrub away the gnawing dread that clung to her like damp November air. Across the table, Mike nursed a beer, his boots propped on a chair, oblivious to the tension thickening between them. "I called Mom this morning," Emily said, her voice tight as she set the plate down with a clink. "She thinks Shadow's onto something. Said dogs don't growl like that for no reason. It could be a warning." Mike snorted, tipping the bottle back. "Ruth? The lady who thinks her old beagle predicts the weather? Come on. That's just her hippie nonsense talking. She's raised dogs her whole life." Emily shot back, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "She knows them better than we do. What if Shadow's picking up on something we're missing? Like the gas leak? He knew before we did." "That was different," Mike said, his tone hardening. "That was a fluke, a lucky break. He's not some psychic mutt. You're letting your nerves get the better of you." Emily's cheeks flushed. "My nerves? I'm not the one pretending everything's fine, while our dog acts like he's guarding Ethan from the Grim Reaper every night." She tossed the towel onto the counter, her hands trembling. "I can't sleep, Mike. I keep hearing that growl, wondering what he's seeing that we're too blind to catch." Mike set the beer down, leaning forward. "Look, I get it you're worried, but we've got a kid to raise, a farm to run. I'm not chasing Shadows because Shadow's got a bee in his bonnet. If it's that serious, call a vet. Get him checked." "I already booked one for tomorrow," Emily said, crossing her arms. "But I'm not stopping there. I'm calling someone to check the house, pipes, gas lines, whatever. If Shadow's growling at something real, I want to know." Mike rolled his eyes. "Waste of money, but fine. Knock yourself out." The next afternoon, a plumber named Dave rolled up in a beat-up pickup, his toolbox clanking as he stepped onto the porch. He was a wiry guy with a graying beard, the kind who'd seen every leaky faucet in Willow Creek. Emily led him inside, Shadow trailing close behind, his ears twitching. "Just check everything," she said, her voice low. "I don't care if it sounds crazy. I need peace of mind." Dave nodded, unfazed. "Heard weirder. Had a lady last year swear her cat smelled a gas leak. Turned out she was right." He knelt by the kitchen sink, wrench in hand, while Shadow watched from the doorway, his tail still. Emily hovered nearby, glancing at Ethan napping in his bouncer. The house hummed with its usual sounds, the fridge buzzing, the wind rattling the windows, until Dave moved upstairs to Ethan's room. That's when it happened. Shadow's head snapped up, his growl starting low and building into a snarl as Dave approached the crib. Before Emily could react, Shadow lunged, teeth bared, slamming into Dave's legs. The plumber yelped, stumbling back against the wall, his wrench clattering to the floor. "Get him off me!" Dave shouted, flailing as Shadow barked, a wild edge to his voice. Emily grabbed Shadow's collar, yanking him back with all her strength, her heart hammering. "Shadow, stop it! Stop!" Dave scrambled to his feet, red-faced and panting. "Lady, your dog's nuts. I'm outta here, you're lucky I don't sue." He grabbed his tools and bolted down the stairs, the front door slamming behind him. Emily sank to the floor, still clutching Shadow, her breath ragged. The dog panted, his fur bristling, but he didn't fight her grip. Ethan stirred in his crib, whimpering softly, and she crawled over to soothe him, her hands shaking. "What's wrong with you, boy?" she whispered to Shadow. "What's got you so riled up?" Mike stormed in an hour later, his face dark as a thundercloud. "Dave just called me from the gas station," said Shadow. Damn near took his knee off. "What the hell, Em?" "He didn't bite him," Emily protested, standing in the living room with Ethan on her hip. "He just freaked out. I don't know why. Maybe Dave got too close to the crib." "Too close?" Mike's voice rose. "He's a plumber, not a burglar. This is getting out of hand. That dog's gone crazy, and you're feeding into it with this paranoid crap." "I'm not paranoid," Emily snapped, her eyes blazing. "Shadow's never hurt anyone. He's scared, Mike, not crazy. What if he's right? What if there's something in this house? Something with Ethan?" "There's nothing here," Mike shouted, throwing his hands up. "The vet'll say he's fine," Dave found squat, "and you're still chasing ghosts because your mom fed you some old wives' tale. I'm done with this." Emily's throat tightened, tears prickling her eyes. "And I'm done pretending everything's okay when it's not. Shadow saved us once. I'm not ignoring him now." Mike stared at her, jaw clenched, then grabbed his coat. "I've got chores. You figure out what you want to believe." He walked out, the screen door banging shut, leaving Emily alone with Ethan and Shadow. She sank onto the couch, Ethan fussing against her chest, Shadow pressing close to her side. The house felt heavier now, its creaks louder, its shadows deeper. She replayed the scene in her head, Shadow's sudden fury, Dave's panic, Mike's anger. Ruth's words echoed. "Dogs don't growl for no reason." But Mike's dismissal stung too. "You're letting your nerves get the better of you." Outside, the cornfield rustled under a graying sky, whispering secrets she couldn't hear. Emily stroked Shadow's fur, feeling his warmth, his steady breath. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" she murmured. "But what?" The vet would come tomorrow, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Shadow's growls were a thread, and she'd pull it until the truth unraveled, or it snapped. The vet's visit left Emily with more questions than answers. Dr. Larson, a gray-haired man with a gentle drawl, had poked and prodded Shadow in the living room that morning, his stethoscope glinting under the weak November light filtering through the curtains. "He's healthy as a horse," he'd said, scratching Shadow's ears. "No ear infections, no arthritis, nothing to explain the growling. Could be behavioral, though. Stress, maybe." Emily had nodded, her stomach twisting, but she didn't buy it. Stress didn't make a dog growl like a sentinel every night at the same damn time. Mike, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed, had seized on it. "See? Told you he's fine. You're making a mountain out of a molehill, Em." His tone was smug, but there was an edge to it. Exhaustion, maybe, or frustration. Emily didn't respond, just thanked the vet and watched him drive off in his dusty Jeep, Shadow's clean bill of health ringing hollow in her ears. By dusk, the tension in the Harper house was a live wire. Emily rocked Ethan in the nursery, humming a lullaby she barely remembered, while Shadow lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every creak of the old floorboards. Mike was out back, tinkering with the tractor, his absence a silent rebuke. She tried talking to him again after the vet left, pleading her case. If he's not sick, then it's something else, something here. But Mike had cut her off. Drop it, Em. I'm not playing ghost hunter because Shadow's got a wild hair. She couldn't drop it. Not when Shadow's growls haunted her dreams. Not when Dave the plumber's panicked exit replayed in her mind. Emily set Ethan in his crib, brushing a lock of dark hair from his forehead, and whispered, I'll figure this out, baby, I promise. Shadow whined softly, nudging her leg, and she knelt to stroke his fur. You're not crazy, are you, boy? I believe you. That night, Mike made his move. Emily was in the bathroom, washing her face, when she heard the jingle of Shadow's collar and a grunt from downstairs. She froze, the cold water dripping down her chin, then bolted to the landing. In the dim glow of the porch light filtering through the window, she saw Mike dragging Shadow toward the back door. A length of rope looped around the dog's neck. Shadow resisted, paws scrabbling on the hardwood, his growls muffled but defiant. Mike, what the hell are you doing? Emily's voice cracked as she raced down the stairs, her socks slipping on the last step. I'm locking him up, Mike snapped, yanking the rope harder. He's out of control, attacking Dave, growling all damn night. I'm not letting a loose cannon near my kid. No, Emily lunged, grabbing his arm. You can't do this. He's not dangerous. He's trying to warn us. Mike shook her off, his face a mask of fury. Warn us about what, Em? Thin air? I'm done with this paranoid bullshit. He's staying in the old kennel out back, till you come to your senses. He shoved the door open, the cold night air rushing in, and hauled Shadow outside. Emily followed, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking. Please, Mike, don't. He saved us once. What if he's right again? What if Ethan needs him? But Mike didn't stop. He tied Shadow to the rusted kennel frame behind the shed, the dog's barks echoing into the dark. Sleep on it, he said, brushing past her back into the house. The door slammed shut, leaving Emily shivering in her pajamas, staring at Shadow's silhouette against the moonlit cornfield. She sank to her knees in the frostbitten grass, sobbing. I'm sorry, boy, she whispered. Shadow whimpered, straining against the rope, his eyes locked on her. The betrayal cut deeper than the wind. She'd let him down, let Mike override her gut. But what could she do? Drag him back inside and fight Mike all night? She stumbled upstairs, collapsing beside Ethan's crib, her hand resting on his tiny chest. Without Shadow's warmth beside her, the nursery felt empty, vulnerable. Sleep wouldn't come. The wind picked up, howling through the cornfield like a banshee, rattling the windows. Emily stared at the ceiling, counting Ethan's breaths, when a thud jolted her upright. It came from outside, loud, frantic, like something heavy hitting wood. She threw off the blanket and ran to the window, peering into the storm-swept yard. Her breath caught. Shadow was slamming himself against the kennel door, his bark swallowed by the gale, blood streaking his muzzle where he chewed through the rope and smashed into the shed. Shadow! She screamed, racing downstairs, not bothering with shoes. The back door flew open, and she sprinted into the yard, the freezing mud sucking at her feet. Shadow broke free just as she reached him, lunging through the shattered kennel frame, shards of wood splintering around him. He bolted for the house, blood dripping from his jaws, and crashed into the glass storm door, cracking it with a sickening crunch. Emily grabbed him, her hands slick with his blood, her voice raw. Stop, Shadow, please, he panted, wild-eyed, but didn't fight her this time. He just pushed against her, shoving her toward the stairs. That's when she felt it. A faint dizziness, a metallic tang in the air, sharp and wrong. Her knees buckled, and she gripped the railing, gasping. What's happening? Mike burst from the bedroom, rubbing his eyes. What the hell's going on now? He barked, then froze at the sight of Shadow, bloodied and loose, barking furiously at the nursery door. Emily clutched Shadow, her vision swimming. Something's wrong, Mike. I can feel it. The air thickened, her words slurring, and Shadow's barks grew desperate, clawing at the door like a beast possessed. Whatever he'd sensed all those nights, it wasn't waiting anymore. It was here. The storm roared outside the Harper house, a beast clawing at the walls with icy fingers. Emily clung to the banister, her vision blurring as the metallic tang in the air thickened, coating her throat like rust. Shadow's barks pounded in her ears, sharp and insistent, his bloodied paws scraping the nursery door. She stumbled forward, her bare feet numb against the hardwood, driven by a primal urge she couldn't name. Mike stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his sleep-rumpled hair wild in the flickering light of a dying bulb. "What's he doing now?" he growled, but his voice wavered, uncertainty creeping in. "Something's wrong," Emily rasped, her words slurring as dizziness spun her head. "I can feel it, Shadow knows." She shoved past him, fumbling with the nursery doorknob, her hands slick with Shadow's blood. The door swung open, and Shadow bolted inside, a black streak against the yellow walls, straight for Ethan's crib. Emily followed, her heart a hammer against her ribs. The room swayed, the star mobile above the crib twisting in a lazy, sickening spiral. Shadow reared up, his front paws slamming onto the crib's edge, his growls morphing into a frantic snarl. He clawed at the blanket, shredding it, then sank his teeth into Ethan's onesie, yanking the baby free with a force that made Emily scream, "Shadow, no!" She lunged, shoving Shadow aside, her knees cracking against the floor. The dog stumbled, barking wildly, but didn't snap back. His eyes locked on Ethan, wide and desperate. Emily scooped her son into her arms, her breath hitching as she saw his face. Pale as moonlight, lips tinged blue, his tiny body limp. "Ethan?" she whispered, shaking him gently. No response. "Ethan." Her voice broke into a sob, raw and piercing, as she pressed her ear to his chest. Nothing, no flutter, no breath. "Mike!" she screamed, cradling Ethan against her. "He's not breathing." The words tore from her like a knife, slicing through the haze in her mind. Mike barreled in, his face draining of color, his hands trembling as he reached for their son. "Give him to me," he barked, but Emily clutched Ethan tighter, her tears soaking his onesie. Shadow barked again, a deafening howl, and lunged at the crib, his teeth ripping into the mattress. Mike grabbed him by the scruff, yanking him back. "Get him out of here. Damn it. He's making it worse." But Emily's eyes darted to Shadow, then to the wall behind the crib, a thin crack, barely visible, snaking through the faded paint. She'd seen it before, when Dave checked the house, but Mike had dismissed it as wind damage. Now, a faint hiss leaked from it, a whisper of death in the storm's roar. "Wait!" she cried, shoving Mike's arm away. "The wall, listen." She stumbled to her feet, Ethan still in her arms, and pressed her ear to the crack. The hiss grew sharper, a venomous thread weaving through the air. Her head spun again, harder this time, and she staggered back, nearly dropping Ethan. "It's gas, something's leaking." Mike froze, his grip loosening on Shadow. "That's impossible." Dave checked it, but his voice faltered, his eyes darting to the crack, then to Ethan's lifeless form. Shadow broke free, leaping back to the crib, his nose shoving at the wall as if he could claw the danger out. Emily's mind raced, fragments of memory crashing together, Shadow's growls, the dizziness, Ruth's warning. Dogs sense things we can't. She thrust Ethan into Mike's arms, her voice shaking but firm. "Call 911 now." Mike fumbled for his phone, swearing as the screen showed no signal, the storm's fury cutting them off from the world. "No bars, damn it," he yelled, pacing the room. "What do we do?" Emily didn't answer. She dropped to her knees beside Ethan, her hands trembling as she laid him on the floor. Shadow nudged her, his nose pressing into Ethan's neck, and she saw it the way he'd pushed at her earlier, guiding her. "He's showing me," she gasped, pressing her palms to Ethan's chest. She pushed once, twice, mimicking CPR she'd seen on TV, her sobs choking her. "Come on, baby, breathe." Mike dropped beside her, his hands hovering uselessly. You don't know what you're doing, stop." But Shadow barked again, a sharp command, and nosed Ethan's throat, as if pointing. Emily ignored Mike, pressing harder, her rhythm frantic. "Please, Ethan, please." Seconds stretched into eternity, the storm's howl blending with her cries, until a cough, weak and wet, burst from Ethan's lips. His eyes fluttered open, a wail splitting the air, and Emily collapsed over him, sobbing, "You're alive? Oh God, you're alive." Mike scooped Ethan up, clutching him to his chest, his own eyes wet. "Jesus, he choked out, rocking their son as Shadow slumped beside them, panting, his muzzle streaked with blood and mud. Emily grabbed Shadow, burying her face in his fur, her voice a broken whisper. "You saved him. You saved him." The dizziness lingered, her lungs burning, but Ethan's cries were a lifeline pulling her back. She looked at the crack in the wall, the hiss still faint but real, and then at Mike. "We need to get out now." Mike nodded, his face ashen, and stumbled to his feet, Ethan in his arms. Shadow staggered after them, limping from his escape, as they fled the nursery, the storm's rage chasing them down the stairs. Whatever Shadow had sensed all those nights had finally struck, and it wasn't done with them yet. The storm's fury faded to a low growl as dawn broke over Willow Creek, painting the sky a bruised purple. Emily sat on the sagging porch steps, her arms wrapped around Ethan, his soft whimpers muffled against her chest. The cold bit at her bare feet, still smeared with mud from the frantic night, but she barely felt it. Her focus was on the bundle in her lap. Alive, breathing, a miracle she'd almost lost. Mike paced the yard, his phone pressed to his ear, barking at someone on the other end. Shadow lay beside her, his head resting on her knee, his blood-matted fur a testament to the battle he'd fought. The air still carried that faint metallic tang, a ghost of the terror they'd escaped. Inside, the house was a tomb they couldn't yet face. After Ethan's first cry had pierced the chaos, they'd stumbled downstairs, choking on the thickening haze, and collapsed in the yard, gulping clean air. Mike had tried the phone again, miraculously. A single bar flickered to life and called 911. The dispatcher promised help, but the storm had clogged the roads with fallen trees. It'd be hours before anyone reached their isolated corner of the Midwest. For now, they waited, huddled together under a blanket from the truck, the reality of what happened sinking in like frost into bone. A pediatrician arrived first, a wiry woman named Dr. Patel, her SUV crunching over the gravel just past 7 a.m. She knelt beside Ethan, her flashlight darting over his pale face, her stethoscope cold against his chest. Emily watched, her breath shallow, clutching Shadow's collar as if he might vanish too. "He's got sleep apnea," Dr. Patel said finally, her voice clipped but kind. "Severe, likely congenital. His airways collapsing when he sleeps. That's why he stopped breathing. You got to him just in time, a few more minutes, and..." She trailed off, letting the unspoken hang heavy. Emily's stomach lurched, her eyes flooding again. "Sleep apnea? But he's been fine. We never noticed anything." "It can hide," Dr. Patel replied, adjusting her glasses. "Babies don't always show signs until it's critical. You're lucky you caught it." "How did you know?" Emily glanced at Shadow, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. "It wasn't us," she said softly. "It was him. He's been growling every night, waking us up. Last night, he pulled Ethan out of the crib, showed me what to do." Dr. Patel raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. "Smart dog," she muttered, scribbling on a clipboard. "We'll need to get Ethan on a monitor, run some tests. He's stable now, but he'll need watching." Mike hung up his call, his face drawn as he joined them. "Fire department's on their way, said they'll check the house. I told them about the crack in the wall, the gas smell." He looked at Ethan, then at Shadow, his jaw tight. "You really think he knew?" "He did." Emily said, her voice steady despite the tears. He's been trying to tell us all along. The fire crew arrived an hour later, their yellow truck rumbling up the drive. A stocky man named Captain Reese led the charge, his team fanning out with detectors and tools. Emily and Mike watched from the porch, Ethan cradled between them. As Reese emerged from the nursery, his face grim. "You've got a carbon monoxide leak," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Old heating pipe behind the wall cracked, probably from settling. It's low level, not enough to knock out adults right away, but for a baby, lethal over time. Combined with his breathing issue, it's a damn miracle he's still here. Mike's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "Dave checked that wall. He said it was fine." "Could have missed it," Reese shrugged. "Pipes like these are tricky, slow leaks build up quiet. Your dog must have smelled it, or sensed the kid struggling. Either way, you owe him big." Emily buried her face in Shadow's fur, her sobs muffled. "He saved us again," she whispered, her fingers tracing the dried blood on his muzzle. "Twice now." Mike sank onto the step beside her, his bravado crumbling. He reached for Shadow, his hand hesitating before resting on the dog's head. "I'm sorry, boy," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I was wrong, so damn wrong." Shadow licked his hand, a quiet forgiveness, and Mike's shoulders shook, tears spilling onto the weathered wood. Dr. Patel stepped back, giving them space, while Reese's team sealed off the nursery, their radios crackling with updates. Emily looked at Mike, then at Ethan, his tiny chest rising and falling under the blanket. "We could have lost him," she said, her voice barely audible, "if Shadow hadn't fought so hard." "I know," Mike said, his eyes red. "I didn't listen to you, to him. I thought I was protecting us, but I almost—" He couldn't finish, just pulled her close. Ethan pressed between them, a fragile heartbeat binding their fractured night. The truth settled over them like ash. Shadow hadn't just sensed one danger, but two. The gas, seeping slow and silent, poisoning the air Ethan breathed, and the apnea, a hidden killer striking in the dark. How he'd known, they couldn't say. Was it the faint hiss of the pipe, the stutter of Ethan's breath, or something deeper, woven into his loyal soul? Emily didn't care. She held him tighter, her guardian in fur, and vowed never to doubt him again. Reese clapped Mike on the shoulder as he headed back to the truck. "Get that pipe fixed and keep that dog close. He's worth his weight in gold." The crew rolled out, leaving the Harpers in the quiet aftermath, the cornfield whispering beyond the house. Emily looked at the nursery window, now taped off with yellow caution tape, and shivered. Shadow's growls had been a lifeline, a thread they'd nearly cut. But one question lingered, sharp as the wind. What had he sensed first? The gas or Ethan's struggle? And how many nights had he stood guard, waiting for them to hear? The sun climbed over Willow Creek, spilling gold across the frost-tipped cornfield. But the Harper house stood silent, a relic of the night's terror. Emily sat on the tailgate of Mike's truck, Ethan bundled in a quilt against her chest, his soft breaths a rhythm she'd never take for granted again. Shadow sprawled beside her, his head heavy on her thigh. His wounds cleaned but raw, a jagged cut on his muzzle from the glass, a limp in his hind leg from the kennel's splintered wood. Mike leaned against the truck, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at the nursery window where yellow caution tape fluttered like a grim flag. The air smelled of damp earth and relief, but the weight of what they'd survived pressed down, heavy as the storm clouds now drifting away. Dr. Patel had left with a promise to follow up. Ethan would need a sleep monitor, maybe surgery down the line, but he'd live. The fire crew had sealed the leak, promising a full repair once the roads cleared. For now, the Harpers couldn't stay. The house was a hazard, its walls whispering poison. Mike had called his brother in town. They'd bunk there until it was safe. But as Emily watched Shadow's ears twitch at the rustle of leaves, she knew one thing. Wherever they went, he'd be with them, a shadow stitched to their side. "We're selling this place," Mike said abruptly, his voice rough but resolute. "I don't care if we take a loss. I'm not raising Ethan in a death trap." He kicked at a pebble, sending it skittering across the gravel. Should have listened to you from the start, Em. About Shadow. Emily looked at him, her eyes still red from crying, but softened now. You couldn't have known, she said quietly. None of us did. But he did. She scratched Shadow's ears, his tail thumping weakly against the metal. He's more than a dog, Mike. He's family. Mike nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, family. He crouched beside Shadow, running a hand along his flank, his fingers lingering where the fur was matted with dried blood. You're a hell of a fighter, boy. I won't forget it. Shadow's tongue flicked out, brushing Mike's wrist, and for the first time in days, a faint smile cracked Mike's weathered face. They packed what they could: clothes, Ethan's crib mattress, Shadow's chewed-up blanket, and piled into the truck. As Mike turned the key, the engine rumbling to life, Emily glanced back at the house. Its sagging porch and peeling paint looked less like home now, more like a stranger they'd outgrown. She held Ethan closer, whispering, "We'll be okay, little man. We've got Shadow watching over us." The drive to town was quiet, the cornfield blurring past in streaks of gold and brown. Ethan dozed in his car seat, Shadow curled up beside him, his nose resting on the baby's tiny hand. Emily watched them, her chest aching with a mix of gratitude and guilt. How many nights had Shadow stood guard, growling at dangers she'd dismissed? How close had they come to losing everything? That evening, at Mike's brother's cramped duplex, Emily dug through a box of old papers from the shelter where they'd adopted Shadow. She needed something, anything, to anchor her after the chaos. Nestled between vaccination records was a faded Polaroid, its edges curled. Shadow, younger and scruffier, sitting beside a toddler in a high chair. On the back, in shaky handwriting, Buddy and Max, 19. A note slipped out too, yellowed and creased. Buddy barked like mad one night, thought he was nuts. Next day, Max was gone. Carbon monoxide. Wish we'd listened. Emily's breath caught, her fingers trembling as she showed it to Mike. Look at this, she whispered, her voice breaking. He's done this before with another family. They didn't hear him in time. Mike stared at the photo, his jaw tightening. Max. He didn't make it? He sank onto the couch, rubbing his face. Jesus. Shadow Buddy. He lost a kid once. That's why he fought so hard for Ethan. Emily nodded, tears spilling over. He couldn't save Max, but he saved us. Twice, the gas leak 3 years ago, and now this. She knelt beside Shadow, who'd settled on a rug by the couch, and pressed her forehead to his. You carried that all this time, didn't you? You weren't gonna let it happen again. Shadow whined softly, his eyes meeting hers, deep, knowing, carrying a weight no dog should bear. Emily sobbed into his fur, her gratitude a tidal wave. Mike joined her, wrapping an arm around them both, Ethan stirring in his portable crib nearby. We're not just survivors, Mike said, his voice thick. We're his second chance. The next week, they started fresh. Mike researched canine instincts, signing up for a seminar on how dogs detect danger. He wanted to spread the word, help others hear what he'd missed. Emily wrote a blog post about Shadow, her words raw and honest, hoping one reader might trust their pet's warning. They'd rebuild, not just a home, but a life where Shadow's growls would always be heeded. Every night, Shadow slept beside Ethan's crib, his ears alert, a sentinel in the dark. Emily watched him sometimes, marveling at the bond, a dog who'd defied fate twice, a boy who'd live because of it. She whispered to him once, as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., "You taught me to trust what I can't see, buddy." Thank you. But questions lingered, echoes in the quiet. Had Shadow sensed the gas first, or Ethan's faltering breath? Did he carry Max's ghost as a burden or a vow? And that other family, had they ignored him too long, or was fate too cruel? Emily didn't know. She only knew Shadow had won this time, a victory carved in blood and love, and that was enough.